Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a GiovedìScienza.
Good evening, welcome to you all, thank you very much, and welcome to GiovedìScienza, Science on a Thursday.
Settimana fa abbiamo parlato di Neanderthal con la
A few weeks ago, we spoke about Neanderthals with Senera Nelli from the University of Turin, very good researcher and a winner of the 2018 GiovedìScienza Prize. And this evening, we're sort of moving on from that because we're moving back in time and we're starting about 6 million years ago. And at a certain point, we focus on our history, the history of Homo sapiens. And we will be discovering some very interesting things, a few surprises. A British person, but also British people and also Spaniards with dark skin but light eyes. And also that there's been more than one exit from Africa, probably, nearly surely. And also that there have been there's been more crossing than expected. But these are not really surprises. It's a story, it's a journey, starting from Africa, which Guido Barbujani, who is sitting next to me, will be telling us about.
Guido Barbujani è un genetista, docente all'Università di Ferrara.
Guido Barbujani is a geneticist. He has been a lecturer at the University of Ferrara for many years, but he's also taught in Padua and in the US. And he was one of the first to apply statistics to the study of genetics, to the figures and the facts that come from genetics. Before giving him the floor, I'd like to ask him a question. Since last week, we spoke about the Neanderthals. The discovery of the first Neanderthal is 1856, if I'm not mistaken. And 3 years later, the first edition of The Origin of Man by Darwin. Do you think that's a coincidence? Well, good evening. Thank you very much for the round of applause. You've put me into difficulty because after the round of applause, I feel I have to do something extraordinary. Don't worry, you'll have another round of applause at the end. Well, when Darwin published his book, he decided not to speak about humans because he realized because he had difficulties, because he was a member, not of the aristocracy, but of the middle upper class, to put to humans with all the other creatures would generate or trigger reactions that had very little to do with science and a lot to do with other things. But it was clear to Darwin and to his cooperators that sooner or later some old fossil would have appeared that would have proven that humans too had evolved exactly like other animals. Because also amongst those who believed in evolution, some thought that we were so special that maybe we had been spared the work of evolving. So this old person that was called Neanderthal, and that means the new man, which is in Neumann's name, but you know that Descartes became Cartesius, and Neumann made his name into Neander, and they named this valley in his name. So the old fossil was named after a new man. I would like to now invite Guido Barbujani, and I hope you enjoy the conference.
L'idea di questa conferenza è sostenere in sostanza che la storia dell'umanità.
The idea of this conference is to basically say that the history of humanity is the history of human migrations, mostly. And I would like to start with an illustration that you more or less know. I'm sure you've all seen this. That is to say, our forefathers who look like monkeys and then chimps and then develop into us. This is wrong. because it suggests that it was necessary for these creatures who lived 6 million years ago, who haven't even got a name because we don't know what they look like, because we call them the common ancestors of humans and chimps. It was not necessary for them to develop into us. We have understood that this was not what it was. There are various human forms, and of all these human forms, there's only one, which makes it easier for us because it would be very complicated to discuss of rights if we had more than one species. But it was not a sine qua non for it to become as it is. What you can see on the left is probably a more sensible way. Here you can see the evolution. There is a first phase, a few million years, where there are creatures who have more to do with us than chimps, and we call these hominids. A group that we call the Australopithecus. Lucy, you're all aware of Lucy, I'm sure, and there we find that there are creatures that very probably are our direct ancestors. And then two groups break off, one that we call Homo, and we will see why we call those Homo, not the others, and the others that are called Paranthropus, that look like us, took a different route, and in the end became extinct. All this starts in Africa, and once again, Charles Darwin had guessed. As we said, the first human fossil appeared 3 years later when Darwin had written his book, but with a very simple thought, said gorillas and chimps are our closest relatives. They're in Africa. Probably the humans come from Africa too. And so he was right 6 million years ago. Climate experts tell us something changed. In a continent that is very hot and wet, they develop, especially in the eastern area, a drier climate, which means that the forest is replaced by a savanna. I was saying that that ancestor of ours, we don't know what he or she looked like, lived there. And there was a split. There were those who decided to continue on trees and the others who came down from the trees. And this first migration, just a few meters, had in fact consequences that were very important. So with these slides, I have given numbers, but they're numbers that I invented. It's not a proof, but I've called it migration 1, and it is probably from the trees to the ground. Charles Darwin used to say that to understand when these people become human is not so interesting because it depends on what we define as a human being, which has nothing to do with science, but of the way we look at the world. But Darwin did recognize 3 features: the fact that you stand up, the enormous brain that we have as in relation to our body, and language. And he thought that these 3 things had evolved at the same time. Nowadays, we have lots of fossils, and we have realized that, in fact, what would appear to be the least noble of these features, that is to say, standing the erect position, is the first one, which also triggered the other changes that led us to be what we are. That is to say, we're bipeds. We can understand this from the skeletons that have been found in Africa if you were walking on 2 or 4 limbs, because the position of the backbone changes. So even by simply finding the skull, we can say exactly whether the person was walking standing up or not. Here you can see this. This on the left is the extraordinary fossil document, these prints that you can see on the left. On the left, you have the scientific fact, and on the right, you have the artist's impression, and we'll have more than one. What might have happened 3.5 million years ago in Tanzania? A couple of Australopithecus passed over the ash of a volcano. Then it rained, the ash congealed, and therefore we still got the prints. They crossed this region, and they clearly walked on 2 legs standing up. But I forgot to say earlier on that this is extremely unusual. In fact, there are 250 species of primates, and we are the only ones who do this. Chimps and gorilla also help themselves with the upper limbs, or what we call the upper limbs. These prints were also considered the fact that the natural family was a mother, a father, and child, because you can see that in the larger prints there are the smaller ones. There was a smaller one who, not to burn their feet, was trying to walk in their parents' prints. I don't know whether we should be doing this, but I assure you that a little bit from there, a team which includes also Italians, include Giorgio Manzi, who is our best paleontologist, has found a group with 1 male, 3 females, and 2 small ones, which is the traditional gorilla mixed. Maybe they were not simply couples, but they were a little bit more complex because this has a number of consequences. Here you can see on the left a chimp and then an Australopithecus. And as you will observe that in the chimp, the organs are rationally hanging below the backbone. An engineer who wished to plan this would do it exactly like that. When you stand up, this is no longer possible. Weight moves forward. The evolution has helped us a bit, curving our backbone a little, but all those who suffer from backbone, and I think about half the people in this room, me included, know that it hasn't been brilliant. We still have backache. But this is not the main problem. The main problem is that the hips become much smaller, which means that the females in our species have a harder time in giving birth than chimps and gorilla. The evolution makes a few messes because it uses solutions that work, but there are prices to be paid. And our skeleton is built in such an inefficient way, it must mean that the advantage of standing up must be so strong that it is a price that we have paid in evolutionary terms. What's the advantage? That your 2 upper limbs are available to do other things, which means that you can manipulate and handle things, which is linked to the development of this abnormal brain. Here you can see in this graph how in time, from 10 million years ago to now, the volume of your skull grows. Clearly, a brain does not, the matter of the brain is not included in the fossil, but the size of the skull tells us. Bigger skull, bigger brain. If we compare this to other animals, we have the biggest one. Whales have a bigger brain than we do, but their body is much bigger, so it's the ratio that is favorable to us. Here you could see on the left that there is a chimp or an Australopithecus, and we are there, and here you can see the bigger brain. And the question that we can ask ourselves is, in the course of this change, at which point do we become human? It is a topic that was also interesting for many. For example, a Jesuit, a friend of mine, was asking himself when we got a soul. And I don't ask the question in the same way, but it's basically the same question. Darwin said, there is no answer to this, and everybody's trying. What does it mean that you belong to the homo genus? Well, we can list all the things that we do and animals don't. And there's one for each letter of the alphabet: agriculture, bungee jumping, ceramics, and so on, up to X-rays, yoga, and animal husbandry. But to say that we are bungee jumpers and the others are not, frankly, would be a bit disappointing. I've never done any bungee jumping, and I hope that many of you haven't done it either. But at a certain point, why do we start talking about the Homo genus and therefore use the word homo, which in Italian is uomo, which is man? Well, we have Wolfgang Köhler and Sultan, who was born in Estonia, Prussian. But in the early 20th century, he became in charge of the Tenerife zoological station. He was an experimental psychologist, and so he decided to test the intellectual limits of chimps. And the best was called Sultan. And you can see him here in the photos. Maybe I become hypersensitive. I find them very moving because on the left, he's putting one stick into the other to have a longer stick. There's a banana up at the top, and Sultan must find the way to get to the banana. In the middle, he's putting boxes one on top of the other one, and on the right, with his stick, he's coming down, and the banana, manages to get the banana and eat it. But if instead of a stick, or the two sticks that can be put one in the other, they give him a little tree, Sultan breaks the branches and turns them into a stick. But if the branches are too big to break with his hands and they give him a stone with which he could break the branches, Sultan can't do it. He becomes very nervous. He tries to lift the branch, and then at that point, he throws the stone against the banana, and they have to give him them. Sultan, who was the most intelligent chimp, cannot conceive the idea that he can create a tool through another tool. And this was what Danilo Menardi, who was an ethologist who died a few years ago, and I'm pleased to be able to remember the limit of Sultan, which is called the cultural animal. Sultan was not able to create a tool through another tool. I turned it off with another tool, but 2,300,000 years ago, people or beings did. And here you can see that there are stones which have been shaped by other stones. They're called Industrial Davaiana, and associated to skulls like this to creatures who went beyond Sultan, and therefore we class as Homo, and we call them Homo habilis, Ethiopia and Tanzania. You will see from now on a series of artist impressions by two artists, one a French woman called Elisabeth Daines, this one here. The others are by two Dutch twins called Kendis. These are impressions that are made with the same criteria of the identikits of the the police. And they contain also queries. We don't know, for example, if Homo habilis was covered or not with a fur like this. The loss of the fur in human evolution is something rather mysterious. It happened, but we don't really know why or when it happened. So these things that you've seen are hypotheses, putting together a series of elements of knowledge and adding something that we suggest, and then you recognize them. Homo habilis is Homo. If you met him or her today, you would probably not join in. Probably you would call the animals, because they were about 1.20 m, 1.30 m, or with a very small brain. People thought that given that they were so small and not very intelligent, it was not possible for them to move out very far. So before humanity were to emigrate from Africa 2.3 million years ago, so 4 million years in Africa without leaving it, we thought that more time was needed. But a few years ago, in Georgia and the Caucasus, human forms very similar to Homo habilis were found round about 2 million years ago. So there was a first diaspora, which was the exit from Africa of human forms, not us, not Homo sapiens, through probably Palestine and the Mediterranean, that at the time was a closed sea. The man found in Georgia, Homo georgicus, has a skull that is bigger than this, but with features that are very modern. So to migrate, you don't need intelligence, you didn't need long legs, but you need good feet. And in this next slide, you see a more detailed description of what happened. They went the south of Europe, a part of Asia, and clearly they were also in Africa. And different human forms developed. I call them forms and not species for reasons that I'm not going to explain. But if you want to at the end, I can explain what is the concept of species or the notion of species is. Some became famous. For example, here in Asia, there is Homo erectus that you might have heard mentioned. Immediately after Neanderthal, it is the first archaic human that is found. I will show you three that are the most interesting one. This is the one that you heard mentioning, the Neanderthal. And you see here, these are the Kendis brothers. There's something very interesting. Neanderthal smiles. There is no fossil that can document this, but the idea is that these people, whom in literature in the early 20th thousand, because there are also films where the Neanderthals are represented as brutes. There's one, you can see it maybe on YouTube. It's called The Neanderthal Man, and it's called Half Animal, Half Beast, and it is a B Hollywood film. I'm not going to tell you now what it says, but if you want to, we can also see it. Neanderthal is represented as a brute, but possibly this is not so. Wasn't exactly like us. His skull, according to Giorgio Manzi, looks like a rugby ball, while ours looks like a football ball. But use sophisticated tools, or more sophisticated than the ones you've seen. And here the artists have put even an earring, because on some occasions Neanderthals used decorations and ornaments. Neanderthals are the real Europeans. They arrived between 300,000 years ago and round about there until 39,000 years ago. And virtually their culture didn't change only in the very last years. Something starts changing in the Neanderthal culture. And we debate this, whether this is due to a drive of innovation that arrived very later, or mainly to the fact that they were imitating someone technologically more involved that had arrived at that moment. And that someone are the Africans. 190,000 years ago in Ethiopia, Homo kibish, there were creatures who had a skull that was virtually the same as ours, formed a bit like a football. They used technology which was much more sophisticated than the previous ones. These are much more complex, and you can see he has also cut his hair. Once again, we have no proof or evidence that this happened, but it would have been possible with these tools. And so the artist said, well, if it's possible, we will get them to cut or shave their hair. Possibly true, possibly not. For about 100,000 years, these creatures stayed in Africa. And then at a certain point, they went towards Palestine and Israel, and possibly before that, they also went on to Arabia. We're still debating this. And at that point, the other human forms became extinct. But I also want to show you the latest arrival of this family. Look at a hand. The hand is that of a researcher, but look at that little small thing there. A few years ago, about 10 years ago, in Denisova, in a cave in Siberia, there was a team of Russians who were looking for Neanderthals because they found Neanderthal bones in that cave. And they found two teeth that didn't look like Neanderthal teeth, plus a little bit of bone, which was half a phalanx of a little finger. We don't know what this creature looked like. You can't recognize a friend if they show you half a phalanx, so you won't be successful. But in the cold of Siberia, the DNA was perfectly preserved. And we will be talking about DNA in a moment. And this DNA, compared to ours and compared to the Neanderthal one, is different. These people, the people who lived in the Denisova cave at that time, were creatures who were neither part of our species nor of Neanderthals. So the person was called Homo Denisova, the person who was defined genetically and not on the basis of their morphology. So you see that at a certain point, this is a photo of how things were about 150,000 years ago. Giorgio Manzi criticized this, but I won't, because there's one thing that is not correct. We were in Africa, in Europe, and in a larger section of Asia there was Neanderthal. The Denisovians was in this area because we don't really know where they were. Here there was Homo erectus, and here below, this yellow dot on Flores in Indonesia is yet another recent addition, the Homo florensis, discovered in 2006 on this island, also called Hobbit because they were very small. So as you can see, there were lots of people. Possibly the Neanderthals could have continued, or Homo erectus, or we could have continued with 5 species. But when our African ancestors left Africa, certainly from here, probably from this, in a matter of a short time, the other forms became extinct and only the Africans remained. Try to put your hand on your forehead. If it's vertical, you see it's because the Neanderthals had a protruding bone and a sloping forehead, while if your forehead is straight, your Neanderthal try to do this. If you find a chin below your lips, this too is an African feature. The Europeans and the others didn't have it, and since we all have these features, it is reasonable to say that we're all African. We're all African, and we left there. Here, this graph is deliberately ambivalent because it does not choose which one. We also spread around about 70,000 years ago, arrived in Europe, lived side by side with the Neanderthals for about 10,000 years, and then moved, especially in the south of Asia, and very soon reached Australia, the oldest one of 45,000, 50,000 years ago in Australia, the fossil finds. And then we walked to the Americas, because at that time the sea was much lower, and so you could walk to the Americas, clearly knowing how you survive in a completely iced area. That was certainly not very easy. And then we run through the Americas. This is an open one. In a matter of a very short time, those who arrived from Siberia arrived in Patagonia. Why they did this, it is not very clear. While to colonize the islands of the Pacific, you must have navigation techniques. You can't get there on foot. So the Pacific was the one that was colonized or anthropized much later, probably 5,000 years ago. And New Zealand, which is the last large island to be anthropized just over 1,000 years ago. Many aspects of this story are something that we managed to reconstruct, because now we can study DNA not only of living people but also of fossils, not of dinosaurs. We can't study that because in time DNA degenerates and the dinosaurs are too old to study, whatever Michael Crichton says in Jurassic Park. But we can read quite old DNA, for example, the Denisova one. What does reading the DNA means? Please excuse me with all those who are perfectly aware of this, but just to give you an idea. DNA is the handbook for our cells, and that has all the instruction, which means that from the egg with the sperm of the father, we become thousands of billions of cells, all these divisions, the development of the various tissues and organs is according to the instructions in the DNA. This is also a handbook because when we finish the development, when we're adult, DNA tells our cells what they have to do and then starts making mistakes, and then you die. Well, that's it. This idea of a DNA as a text is a classical idea. Mendel, the inventor of genetics, used the letters of the alphabet to indicate the mechanisms of inheritance. He didn't know about DNA, but he was using letters. And this is a metaphor that works because, exactly like a text, it's a linear sequence of letters. There are 21 letters in the Italian alphabet. DNA, likewise, is a sequence of molecules that we indicate with A, T, G, and C. So DNA has only 4 letters. We have more letters in our language, but in the end, it looks like a text because it's a linear sequence of these letters. So it is right to say that we also know its lexicon, because not all DNA is useful for something, but the parts that do are called genes. They produce proteins, and we know most of the genes of our DNA. We call all our DNA as genome. So if we use the word, you will know it, of the human genome and most mammals, there are 20,000 genes, and there are only very few we're not acquainted with. Knowing the function of genes means we can also identify some diseases. For instance, if a pregnant woman is tested and we study a particular gene, we can tell her whether the child will or will not have Duchenne's dystrophy. Likewise, we can also identify some genetic diseases like Huntington's chorea or cystic fibrosis. Many of you will not have heard these diseases mentioned. You don't die of these. You die of heart, Alzheimer's, diabetes, and cancer. So all these diseases is something that we cannot, the ones I've just mentioned, that we cannot foresee because they're complex. They don't depend on one gene not working, but of many genes that then relate to environmental features. We are still unable to understand complex features, which is why the syntax of DNA has not yet been understood. That is to say, how the various genes interact and what the overall effect is. This is the current limit that we have, especially in the biomedical field. But we can read all the text, and it's a very, very long text. In fact, the DNA of each cell is 6.5 billion characters. In my estimate, the PROMESSI SPOSI, the betrothed, written by Alessandro Manzoni, has about 1 million, roughly. I may have made a mistake, but not really. So 1 million means that our handbook is like a bookshelf where there are 6.5 billion divided by 2. You have to divide by 2. So 3.5 billion, trust me, I'm not going to explain this, of bases, which divided by 1 million means that we need 3,500 volumes, each one the size of the betrothed or promessi sposi. In each one of these, the cell has to find the right instructions in a matter of seconds, and we haven't really understood this, how the cell manages to do that. So we analyze all this text, we read it without understanding it, but we can read it all. What is the relationship between this text and our differences? First of all, I was talking to a gentleman who said, if I look at the eyes of people, I can class them. Yes, if we look at people we don't know, there's someone here who isn't totally unknown, but we can roughly contextualize them in the context of this Asia, Africa. This is Yanomama, an American. Now, talking about American and Australian, I will be talking about the original populations, not the more recent ones. And this one is from Polynesia, so all very easy. Well, try these now. Who is the European here? This lady here? She's a Tiritikanawa, and she's Maori. She comes from New Zealand. You think that she's European because she's well-dressed, and we have the presumption that the only ones who can dress are the Europeans, but it's not true. She's also dyed her hair. Who's African here? You might say this, dark skin, curly hair. She is Asian. She comes from the Andaman Islands, south of India. There's a whole area of India where people look like this. So is this the African? No, from Tonga, that is to say, the same continent Titicanawa comes from, but in Oceania, where they come from is there are people who are light and people who are dark. This girl is a Mapuche, and this boy comes from Africa. So as you will see, it is not true that we can locate people by defining where they come from. It is also proved by the fact that 250 years of classification of human races has left us without knowing who peoples are. People in the 19th century thought that they were 27, and each one, here you see a map, corresponded to an area. Racial catalogues extended over time. We reached even 200 different races. And Charles Darwin used to make fun about this. If you said, if you don't know how many human races there are, what do we talk about? DNAs nowadays tells us that these people, as you see, are very different, share about 99.9% of their genome. All the differences that make us unique is that are in 1 per thousand of our DNA. 1 per thousand, but is 1 per thousand of a lot of those 6.5 billion that we were talking about that have to be divided by 2. So on average here, there are 3 million differences. Some are important differences, others are less. So let us forget that what we have in common, let's throw 99.9% of all our DNA, because we're identical, and let us focus on the 1 per thousand which has differences. Here I've put 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And we're talking about the variable areas of DNA. 81% of DNA variations are cosmopolitan. That is to say, they're present in all continents. Who, for example, those of you who has a 0 blood group has a cosmopolitan variation that is present in all 5 continents. B is not, because B is Asia, Africa, and Europe, but not in the Americas and not in Oceania. Right, so the 0 blood group share 81%, and this means that 0.6% is in Europe. There are very few that are pure Europeans. 1% in Asia means that it is easier, but not so easy. But Africa is special, not only because there are the oldest fossils in our species and our close species, but because there are 7% variations that are exclusively African. If we have to summarize this, I would say that we can fall into one of 2 major groups with very few exceptions. Either we're typically African or we're generically human. The other categories don't really count. We can also wonder ourselves, compared to the differences in various continents, say that there are 100. What's the difference between 2 Italians, Nanni Moretti and Renato Carpentieri, whom you can see on this 3-wheeler that's not a very sophisticated, which also gives us an idea that in Europe we're the most developed, in Asia a bit less, and in Africa they walk. What is the difference between 2 from the same population if the difference between people in different continents is equal to 100? Well, this has been estimated, and that is 88. That is to say, our neighbor, on average, is more similar than us, than somebody who comes from another continent, but by 12%. This, on average, means that there's a high degree of variability, that there are people who are like us in our population, but people who are very different. I'll give you an example, but the case that I'm about to example is an extreme case. It's not always like that, but the fact that it can also be like that, indicates how finding biological races in human beings is meaningless. These are the three of the people who've had their genome read. The first one was James Watson and Crick, the discovery with Rosalind Franklin of the double helix DNA. Then Watson said at some point we should conserve the DNA of genes, meaning geniuses, to discover which genes give them their extraordinary ability. I will offer my DNA. And people who certainly didn't have problems of self-esteem. So he was the first who, in 2007, had his DNA read. The year after, Craig Venter, who is a geneticist, read his own and called him human reference genome. Craig Venter, the measure of all things. And a few years ago, whose name is Kim, that name was very common in Korea, and then he compared the DNA of the three. We're talking about all the genome. Nothing is out, and these three share 1,254,570. Then they have their own. Here you see 1,800,000 and 1,132,000. But what the consequences? Well, first of all, it's interesting talking about it, but consequences have a lot to do with our studies. One of the reasons why in the US, but in general in Anglo-Saxon countries, people are so linked to the idea of human race, in spite of the fact that many data says that biologically we cannot distinguish them, is what is known as ethnic medicine. You look at your patient, you understand if they're dark, what group they belong to, or if they're light, or if they're white, or if they're not, and give them, therefore, a more suitable clinical result. This is ridiculous. This child, who's called Jackson Slade, had a severe form of leukemia for which it is necessary to have a bone marrow transplant, and there are big archives of data where bone marrow donors are studied and characterized for their genes, in particular for the ones which might cause rejection. So there's a world archive where all the donors are inserted, and you compare the donors and match them with the person who saved his life for this child, giving him his DNA because his gene was more similar. As this gentleman, who's called Michael Menifee. He's Canadian, and clearly, if he had been studied by one of these racial doctors, would have been excluded because he is clearly of a different skin color, a bit long. So I will try to hurry up because out of Africa, we then go to the other continents. I'll tell something about the Americas because what I'm trying to show you is very interesting because it gives you an idea of how things go. We arrived probably 20,000 years ago, and very rapidly these populations went very rapidly down to Patagonia a few years ago. They found this skeleton in Siberian Malta, and roughly was a 15-year-old. They lived on ice, building huts with mammoth bones, which comes from St. Petersburg's museum. They found these bones. As I was saying, that in cold areas, DNA is better preserved, so we were able to read the genome very clearly. This is one of these rather technical slides. The DNA of the Malta boy was compared to that of many other people who come from those other areas. Red means that it resembles the Malta ones. Blue means that it doesn't. And as you can see, all the ones that are in America resemble a lot to the Malta. And this is one of the clearest proofs of the fact that this is where we come from. But the other most interesting things is that now in Siberia, we have DNAs that are very different from the ones of those who were there 24,000 years ago. This means that they either all moved giving rise to the American populations, or that the ones that stayed here were extinct and were replaced by others. Now that we can study ancient DNA, we realize that this is not an exception, but it's the rule. And in Europe, we know that there are 3 layers of population that arrived all from Africa, but in 3 different waves. So we're now reaching the present. Here we have migrations that are so recent that they've left very little traces. We know that there was the colonial phase where Europeans went throughout the world, which is why English and French and Spanish and Portuguese are spoken the world throughout. Then we have slaves, which brought a lot of people from Western Africa to the Americas, not to Europe, because we didn't want to see them. But these are relatively recent phenomena. But we've also studied them from a genetic point of view by studying this creature here. This is a bacterium. It's called Helicobacter pylori. It has no legs, so it can't migrate on its own. But Helicobacter pylori also migrated in people's guts at one time. You remember that people thought that ulcers were psychosomatic. If you're very nervous, you get ulcers. It wasn't true. Ulcer is generated by this bacterium, and half of us have in our intestine. Many of us have absolutely no effects, while others have an ulcer. But by following these strains of Helicobacter pylori, we see that we find it in North America, Southern America, Australia, so we can follow these recent migrations, both the slave trade and also the passage from Siberia to the America, studying a passenger of our body rather than ourselves, since it accumulates more differences because of its speed of replication. Then we have a migration. We're now going from biology to sociology, and on this I won't say much, but one thing I would like to say, because there's a lot of concern, and people are talking about it because of the migration flows that are coming from Africa to Europe. This is a very recent fact where you can see the size of the arrows indicate that it's the number of people who are moving. As you can see that the arrows from America and Africa are in fact rather small. The big movements, the big mixes, are inside continents. The biggest of all is taking place in Asia, where there are millions and millions of people who are moving. So this is a case where our perception does not correspond to the facts and figures. Why this happens, I have nothing to add. I would like to conclude in offering a remark which is not mine, because I'm not an expert of these things, but that I heard Wlodek Goldkorn, who formerly was in charge of culture for the Espresso. He is a Polish Jew who lives in Italy, and talking about what we're talking about, he suggests that he considers this image that many of you know, which is the raid of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1944. Goldkorn says that when we look at this image, the emotional center is the child. The frightened child is the emotional center, and we feel compassion for him, and we identify if we're human. But identifying in this child, being moved, is altogether easy and does not create problems, while Goldkorn invites us to identify ourselves with this other gentleman, the one who is pointing the gun, the one who is actually performing the raid, because that is the difficult question. Would we be able to say that there's another human being in front of him, or would we choose the easiest and more peaceful solution, that is to say that violence and injustice should be carried out? According to Wlodek Goldkorn, and according to me too, is the important question, and it's the question that we all have to ask ourselves when we see scenes like this, in a moment when we are the ones holding the gun. We can leave this woman in the barbed wire, or we can give her a hand, but this is not free. It'll have a price. Are we not ready to pay this price? I would like to stop here, and if you don't want, I have another 4 things on the evolution of skins of Europeans. Well, we still have some time, so I would say that you can continue. Right. I will tell you something on skin, because this is very recent. The color of skin is a very important topic, which is very important also in our relationship that we perceive. But skin doesn't leave any fossils. So how do we know what color our ancestors were? Well, first of all, we try to see how it works. The color of skin is determined by some cells that are called melanocytes that produce melanin. But there are two types of melanins. One is called eumelanin, which is red-brown, and the other one is pheomelanin, and it's red-brown. These granules are then passed over to the surrounding cells, and their production requires 70 different genes. So the color of skins, too, depends on many different elements, and we only understand some of it. But we also know that the environment is important, because if you get suntanned, you get darker. So it depends how big the granules are and how much eumelanin and how much pheomelanin you have. We don't know exactly how things were in the past, but Nina Jablonski, who's an American, who has produced this model. Here you can see the past, and this is the present. She says that if you take a monkey and then you look below the skin, you will see that it is white. So probably our common ancestor was white. Following that, as I said before, there's this mysterious thing: we started losing our hairs. And if you're not protected by this under the African sun, it's best be dark. Because otherwise, if you're too light, you'd have more cancers. The ultraviolet rays cause a cancerous decline. So it means that natural selection that Darwin identified, you start to get mutations. All these numbers and figures and letters are genes. They won't mean anything to you. And those who have a mutation and have a darker skin has a certain advantage as compared to the other. Tends to have more children, and so this spreads. So little by little we get dark skin. Then 100,000 years ago we came to Europe and Asia, and there the selective mechanism inverted, because if you have a dark skin you can't use the sun to activate vitamin D, which is so important in pregnancy and in breastfeeding. So to activate vitamin D you need sun rays, and there is an advantage of having light skin, and this is why Europeans and Asians have light skin. When this happened, we don't know. But we tended to think that since we left 70,000 years ago, within 30,000 years, probably it had this change. But last year's 4 articles were in reading the DNA of some fossils and undergoing an analysis with artificial intelligence. They saw that with 4% of an error, the skin color, this is an Englishman who's called in cheddar, so that's why you have the cheddarman, and you also have cheddar cheese. He was killed probably in a ritual manner, because he had a blow to his head and was hands tied. You can see it with the Candice twins. Had very probably blue eyes and dark skin, a combination which is quite rare nowadays. This became very famous because the British are good at promoting their discoveries, but in Spain, Alabraña in Bichon in Luxembourg, Switzerland, Bichon, sorry, and Lochberg in Luxembourg, between 13 and 17,000 years ago, there were others who had blue eyes and dark skin. It's not a matter of fact that there's an odd Englishman, but at that time, that's what Europeans looked like. Blue eyes and dark skin. 12,000 years ago, the first white skins appeared in the Caucasian area, and they spread in Europe with the arrival of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent. This is the Lavragna man. The arrival of light skins in Europe has happened through migration. It hasn't been a local mutation, somebody who arrived in Europe. And with this, I've concluded. I would like to show you my 4 books. This is Manzi's book that describes very clearly the bone and paleontological data. Recently, the former De Agostini, that's now called Edizione Geográfica, this book by Telmo Piovani that has beautiful maps that I used. And the story that I told you today is in these 2 books that the Barbujani has republished over the past few months. Thank you very much.